Truth Espresso, episode 345.
In a world gone bonkers.
It is not, generally speaking, unruly, but fires have been started and...
Where the culture is a dumpster fire.
We're coming for your children.
And churches have lost their way.
I am really uncomfortable with the story of the crucifixion.
It's time to wake up with Truth Espresso.
Truth Espresso.
Your weekly shot of truth. And now your host, Daniel Minnick.
Hello there, friends, family, foes, and of course, lurkers alike. This is your host, Daniel Minnick, once again for another episode of Truth Espresso. And this episode is not yet continuing my series going through the Book of Mormon. After I learned about some recent events earlier this week, I figured I should do some self-reflection and kind of give my thoughts on the matter, not to make the focus specifically on the people involved, but to give my thoughts for the sake of myself and for the sake of you, the listener of Truth Espresso, because I want to make sure that that's what this is about. So this episode, we're going to look at and ask ourselves the question, what is the purpose of ministry? What really does it mean to serve our Lord Jesus Christ? Why do we do what we do? Why do we go to church? Why do we help out in church? And anyone who's called to be a pastor, a deacon, an elder, an evangelist, anything by which we spread the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ, why do we do it? And I want that to be the focus of this episode, because this episode is going to be kind of in part about addressing the latest issue involving Dr. Josh Buice and G3 Ministries. If you haven't heard or read about this from earlier last week, then this episode will bring you up to date on that. And I know that I've seen a bunch of YouTube videos and some other podcasts talking about this, and it's kind of like covering the news, but I don't want to do that for this episode. There's a reason that I titled the episode the way I did. What is the purpose of ministry? Because this episode is going to be about application for us. I don't want it to be about me wanting to throw my 2 cents into a current events issue, into a news item. I don't want it to be about clicks or downloads. I don't want it to be about exploiting the latest thing. I want this episode to be about what we can learn from this as a challenge to us. I want us to realize that we are not special if we haven't found ourselves in a similar situation. I want this episode to be reflective, self-reflective. I want this episode to be about me, and I want this episode to be about you, and not so much about Dr. Josh Buice or G3 Ministries. So I do want to talk a little bit about what the issue was that happened, what it's dubbed the latest scandal of pastoral ministry or Christian ministers, the latest fall. And unfortunately, that's how we can look at it. But remember, this isn't about Dr. Josh Buice. This is about us. This is about application. So first, I do want to get into a little bit of the background and see what happened, and then focus on what we should learn about from this and how we should apply it to ourselves. So who is this Josh Buice that the internet started talking about last week? for the latest ministry scandal. Well, Dr. Josh Bice is the senior pastor at Praise Mills Baptist Church, or PMBC for short. I will sometimes reference PMBC. I'm talking about Praise Mills Baptist Church. And he was the senior pastor at this church since 2010. In 2013, Dr. Bice started and hosted the first G3 conference on the campus at PMBC. And PMBC was a member church. It was affiliated with the Southern Baptist Convention until 2022, and I'll explain a little bit why that was. And I remember I wasn't too familiar with Dr. Josh Bice until some of this stuff from years ago came up regarding the Southern Baptist Convention. So in 2018, Dr. Bice gathered some influential conservative Christian leaders to draft and sign a statement on social justice and the gospel. And I have read through that statement, and I concur with what it says. I agree with it. But meanwhile, while this was happening, the Southern Baptist Convention, the SBC, seemed to want to propose and vote on resolutions that would accommodate cultural trends into their platform. There was the Revoice conference that, yes, you could say that it was a way of outreach to people who struggled with same-sex attraction, but it seemed like it was always trying to open the door to the idea that you can call someone a homosexual Christian as long as they just didn't practice or they kind of recognize that maybe these desires are just the cross I need to bear in my Christian life, but I can identify this way, and God help me to be able to live a sanctified life and such. Like, it seemed to diminish the idea of recognizing fallenness and wanting to throw some kind of bone to the way the current culture would want us to think about things that we'd recognize as sin or struggles, that it is sin that we're struggling with. But in 2019, the SBC adopted what was called Resolution 9 that said that critical race theory could be an analytical tool that the church can use to evaluate human experiences. And after this resolution was adopted, several churches left the SBC because they could not in good conscience affirm Resolution 9. Dr. Josh Bice was among those who ardently fought against Resolution 9, and yet he said that Praise Mills Baptist Church would stay in the SBC to fight to reform the SBC. And I remember listening to an interview about this and thinking, well, I wish you well in that fight, Dr. Bice. In 2022, PMBC announced it would leave the SBC, and I remember listening to an interview with Dr. Bice about this as well, that kind of eventually, after several years of trying to fight to reform the SBC, he realized it wasn't going to be reformed, so he would leave it. And I was kind of a little bit relieved there, because I was hoping that maybe through that or some actions, maybe it might get some of the leadership of the SBC to rethink some of these resolutions that they were trying to pass. Maybe the SBC would experience another conservative resurgence like they did in the 1990s, early 2000s. But it doesn't seem like that for the time being. Dr. Boyce was also the president of G3 Ministries that began in 2013, and the first one was hosted at Praise Mills Baptist Church. The first year, G3 had about 750 in attendance, but G3 Ministries, as it kept growing, eventually in 2020, it became a 501c3. So it became an official organization and not just an annual event called G3. And G3 Ministries has since grown to where the 2021 event had about 6,500 in attendance. And since G3 Ministries was incorporated in 2020, it also has its own press that publishes books mostly from people associated with the ministry. So G3 definitely and quickly over the years ballooned into a large ministry because it would also host a lot of prominent speakers within conservative Reformed Christianity. So what happened that we're talking about with Dr. Josh Buice? Well, on Monday, May 12th, Praise Mills Baptist Church issued a statement about Dr. Josh Buice, and I will provide a link in the show notes to that you could read the full statement. I will read 2 paragraphs from it to note some things that it demonstrated the problem. So, according to the statement from Dr. Buice's church, it says, "In recent weeks, the elders of PMBC uncovered irrefutable evidence that Dr. Buice has, for the past 3 years, operated at least 4 anonymous social media accounts, 2 anonymous email addresses, and 2 Substack platforms. These accounts were used to publicly and anonymously slander numerous Christian leaders, including faithful pastors, some of whom have spoken at G3 conferences, several PMBC elders, and others." Yes, I emphasize those parts there. "These actions were not only sinful in nature, but deeply divisive, causing unnecessary suspicion and strife within the body of Christ, and particularly within the eldership of PMBC. Dr. Buice had been asked on multiple occasions over the past 2 years whether he had any connection to these anonymous accounts. In each case, he denied any knowledge of them. On Sunday evening, May 4th, 2025, after clear and comprehensive evidence emerged linking the accounts directly to him, the elders of PMBC confronted Josh. For 2 hours, he continued to deny his involvement. Only after further evidence was presented and much pleading with him to walk in the light did Josh finally confess to his actions. Since then, Josh has acknowledged his sin, expressed sorrow, and asked for forgiveness. His desire is to personally ask forgiveness of every person he has slandered or lied to. While Josh has acknowledged with the elders that he is presently disqualified from serving as an elder, we do not believe at this time that his sin is necessarily permanently disqualifying." So that's the end of my reading from the statement. That's not the whole statement. This is a segment of it. You could read the whole thing if you'd like from the link I'll have in the show notes. G3 Ministries also issued a similar statement the same day about what happened and how Dr. Buice resigned as president of G3. So I'll provide a link to that in the show notes. And, there's a lot of similar content, so I'll only read this small portion that has another emphasis to it. So from this statement, there's a part that says, "Accordingly, his content will remain accessible via the G3 website and G3 Plus. To be clear, no other employee or board member of G3 knew Josh was engaged in this activity. He acted alone." And G3 also decided to cancel the scheduled conference that was for later this year and promised to refund all registration fees. And I think that G3 did do the right thing here. They could have gone on, but then they explained it in a later statement. Now, the same day, Founders Ministries released their statement, so I'll provide a link also to that. And one sentence from that statement says this: "Because his actions demonstrate his disqualification for spiritual leadership, we have removed all of Josh's content from our Founders website." So G3 said that they were not going to remove his stuff from the G3 website, but the founders said they were removing all his stuff from their website. But then the next day, Tuesday, May 13th, G3 released an updated statement. So I'll provide a link to the update regarding Josh Buice. And on the updated statement, it says, "After further consideration and godly counsel, we have made the decision to remove all of Josh Buice's content from every platform. This will take some time to accomplish." So they tried to preserve some of his content, believing it was like helpful or it wasn't warranted. And then after founders removed stuff and after further consideration and stuff, they realized it's just probably not worth it to leave stuff there, especially during a time where he was lying, maybe. So maybe we should, just for the sake of avoiding any problems, or maybe even it's just plain best that we also go ahead and remove all his content from our website as well. So what did Dr. Buice do? He created a bunch of anonymous social media accounts, some on X, formerly known as Twitter, some email accounts, and some Substack platforms, and he used these to hide under anonymity so you didn't know that it was Dr. Josh Buice behind those accounts. And he used that anonymity to kind of go after other Christian ministers and even elders in his church, including people that he would invite to the G3 conference to be speakers there. And among those who faced Dr. Buice's libel from anonymous accounts include Dr. John MacArthur, Dr. John Piper, Vodi Bauckham, Doug Wilson, and Tom Askell. I think there could have even been some others. Now, I must admit that when I learned about this on Monday, as it was just being revealed, my first thought was relief that it wasn't another sex scandal like Dr. Stephen Lawson some months ago. However, as I kept learning more about what went on here, my relief wasn't really helped. The problem was becoming more disturbing. Specifically when I read about how there was lying going on for a long time. And, when we read about this, the president of G3 Ministries, the senior pastor at Praise Mills Baptist Church, using anonymous accounts to libel people that he ministered with, how could something like this happen? It just doesn't make sense, does it? Well, as we think about things more, maybe we might start to make sense of it as we reflect more, as we draw some applications. As of this recording, I haven't seen any actual testimony from Dr. Josh Buice for why he did what he did, so I can only offer some educated guesses about it. Now, surely it doesn't make sense to fellowship with faithful ministers of the gospel as another faithful minister and then libel them behind their backs through anonymous internet media accounts. And you might think, this is just so bizarre, so crazy and weird. I can't possibly imagine myself doing something like this. And to that I might say, oh, really? Picture yourself maybe in his shoes. Maybe you won't find yourself doing the exact same thing. But if we consider that what went on behind the scenes could have been pride, and reflect on pride and what it could do to people, pride can make you do some really strange things. So don't go ripping on someone until you've thought about what pride may have made you do, and I would include myself in that category. If you don't nip pride in the bud, you could find yourself looking back at a tragedy, kind of like Dr. Buice is right now, and thinking like Steve Urkel, did I do that? Now, what makes me think that the problem was pride? And I am quite convinced that pride is the culprit. Pride is the explanation, mostly because it reflects what celebrity culture does to ministry. Proverbs 13:10 says, "Only by pride cometh contention, but with the well-advised is wisdom." And Proverbs 11:2 says, "When pride cometh, then cometh shame. But with the lowly is wisdom." And we see in this situation, pride came with contention. And also, when pride comes, we see that shame surely came as a result, and it's tragic. And as others have said, I will also repeat, we seriously need to stop and rethink and even be willing to eliminate the concept of celebrity ministers. I don't mean that someone can't become well-known and influential. I mean, we need to rethink celebrity ministry culture. And it's not that ministers as a class of people are particularly prone to scandals. It's just that celebrity status, particularly embodied in celebrity ministry, creates a public persona that takes on a life of its own. A public persona is an image you project for others to see. You kind of become like a theater actor. You want the public to know you by the character that you play on the stage. And this character is flawless and charismatic. This character is not the vulnerable human who faces daily life struggles, like the person that you experience who's not the public persona that you're trying to project. Now, in full admission, everyone, regardless of whether they're celebrity or not, everyone has what we might consider a public life that is distinct from our private life. In some aspects, this is indeed necessary. You don't have to talk about everything you do outside the pulpit from the pulpit. You don't have to tell your coworkers everything you do at home. And it would be inappropriate for a pastor and his wife to air all their private conversations and activities in sermons and blogs on YouTube and such. You get the idea there. The point is that the bigger the success and the popularity, the more the temptation to nurture a public persona. And if you're not careful, you become schizophrenic. You have two very different versions of yourself. If you polish that public persona into a masterpiece and it keeps growing, you will do whatever it takes to protect the success of your persona, your image, your stage character. It's what keeps you going. It's what gives you success, not the real you.
How is your flame of truth, Christian? Is it burning bright? Hi, I'm Rebecca Berschwinger, creator and host of One Little Candle, a weekly podcast dedicated to encouraging, empowering, and equipping believers to be the light that God has called us to be, so that we may pass down undefiled the truth of God's infallible word to the next generation. So join me and light your own little corner of the world. You can listen to One Little Candle on all major podcast platforms or at christianpodcastcommunity.org.
When we think of celebrity ministers like Ravi Zacharias and recently Dr. Steve Lawson, we see the danger of the slippery slope that celebrity ministry enables. You begin to reason as a celebrity minister that your righteousness is how you measure public success. If souls are touched by your words, it's like a scale that counterbalances what you might find yourself hiding. First, you feel guilty about it, and you fear someone will find out. But as time goes by and you adjust and you hold under your feelings and you go on and no one knows about it, you can ease your conscience. as you see people blessed by your ministry. You can almost convince yourself that you're not really doing that sin that you know you're doing because it's not a part of your public persona. The public persona is, for all intents and purposes, the real you as you continue on the success of celebrity ministry. But as Numbers 32:23 says, be sure your sin will find you out. And unfortunately, we see that happen over and over again. And it's not all sexual sin, as we see in the case of Dr. Josh Buice. Another danger of celebrity ministry is that public success fosters pride, and this is what I think was what was going on. And I don't mean that you necessarily realize that that's what's happening, but it influences what you're doing. Your personal success is tied to the ministry's success. And why not? You put in that effort to get it to where it is now. Why shouldn't you be integral to it? Why shouldn't the ministry's success depend on and generate your own success? That's what I believe is how the thinking becomes transformed. But just what is success in Christian ministry? Let's just think about it. What is Christian ministry? Remember, it's about Christ. And who are we talking about? We're talking about the God-man, the second person of the Trinity, who humbled himself by taking on a human nature, subjecting himself to the tests and trials of it, enduring persecution, and ultimately dying a gruesome death by crucifixion while bearing the sins of many, and these include our own sins. The message of Christianity is the most humbling thing we can proclaim. And how can we preach this gospel of Jesus Christ and treat it as a means to exalt ourselves? As Paul said in Philippians chapter 2, through the humility of the incarnation and its servitude and death, God exalts Jesus and proclaims that everyone will bow the knee and confess Jesus as Lord. And as the great preacher of repentance John the Baptist realized in John 3:30, he said, "He must increase, but I must decrease." But yet, with all this understanding of our position in Christ, even the first century church struggled with pride and contention. The Apostle Paul had to tell people in the church to stop fighting each other. These are people who identified with Christ. This isn't something that's unique to someone like Dr. Josh Buice. This is something that we all struggle with. And it's ironic given what we proclaim. And the Apostle Paul said in 1 Corinthians 3, verses 5 through 7, "Who then is Paul, and who is Apollos, but ministers by whom ye believed, even as the Lord gave to every man? I have planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. So then neither is he that planteth anything, neither he that watereth, but God that giveth the increase." So the Apostle Paul, writing to people in a church that he started, he was telling them that Paul is nothing and Apollos is nothing. It is God who gives the increase. Now there's power in the gospel rightly proclaimed. We could see souls converted with its life-changing truth. We see people become disciples, hungering and thirsting after righteousness, and we can see people as sheep in need of a faithful shepherd. And with that comes the temptation. Even the Apostle Peter had to admonish his fellow elders there, recognizing that they are shepherds over sheep, where he says in 1 Peter 5, verses 2 through 3, Feed the flock of God which is among you, taking the oversight thereof, not by constraint, but willingly, not for filthy lucre, but of a ready mind, neither as being lords over God's heritage, but being examples to the flock. When sheep need a shepherd, they need a humble example who leads with wisdom. But the temptation is there, as Peter acknowledged, with becoming lords over God's heritage. So what do I guess specifically went down with Dr. Josh Buice over the last few years, as the statement from Praise Mills Baptist Church said? Once again, this is my educated guess, so don't quote me on it. I don't have forensic evidence. I could be wrong, and I accept all correction if any new information comes up after this episode has been released. But I really think it was pride. That's what I deduce. That's what I infer. I don't think Dr. Buice was quite prepared to handle the success that G3 would bring. G3 became an annual conference for people to hear and possibly meet well-known ministers that they usually experience only through YouTube and podcasts or books. And now these people were all in one place, and they can go to one place and meet all these people that they followed or at least benefited from listening to sermons and lectures and reading books. These people who come to the G3 conference, they are people who look up to these ministers because they hold to the conservative doctrine to which they relate. They focus on a gospel of truth, and they seem to live exemplary lives. But here's the problem. As G3 grew, Dr. Buice's relevance to the event shrunk. Now, why did more and more people come to G3 over the years? I have a feeling that more came to hear and meet people like Dr. John MacArthur, and Virgil Walker, John Piper, James White, and Voddie Baucham than they did to meet Dr. Josh Buice. But Buice was the mastermind behind this event. He was the mastermind behind the success. He got it started. He put in that work at the start. He continued to put in the work to organize the event. So why shouldn't he be at least on par with these other speakers of renown? That's what I think had been festering for a while and led to things that didn't otherwise make sense. And the Apostle Paul, we could kind of relate to that when the Apostle Paul mentioned in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 at verses 10 through 11. He says, "According to the grace of God which is given unto me, as a wise master builder, I have laid the foundation, and another buildeth thereon. But let every man take heed how he buildeth thereupon. For other foundation can no man lay than that is laid, which is Jesus Christ." The Apostle Paul was the master builder of the church at Corinth, as we see in Acts chapter 18, and yet we see his sincere humility in his letters to this church of Corinth. And we see in verse 21 of the same chapter, the Apostle Paul said, "Therefore let no man glory in men, for all things are yours." And in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, we see Paul having to give facts about how he compared with other people. And even then he kept apologizing for even appearing to exalt himself, even as he had to be truthful with his statements. "I speak as a fool. I speak foolishly," he would say, as he had to say, "I did this more." And as you read this chapter, 2 Corinthians chapter 11, you see Paul's heart melt before these people in utter humility. And I say we need fewer celebrity ministers today and more ministers who act like the Apostle Paul. So back to my thoughts on Dr. Josh Buice and this tragedy. And remember, this isn't about me criticizing him. This is about me recognizing how pride affects people and how pride can affect us. We know Dr. Buice's popularity took a back seat to the others that he invited to the G3 conferences. And we also know that the speakers there, while they all shared a common bond in the fundamentals of the gospel, they did have some differences of beliefs. We had cessationists and continuationists. We had covenant theologians and dispensationalists. We had theonomists and pietists. We have premillennialists and amillennialists and postmillennialists and so on. And there are people who are bothered for sure by some of the positions that some of the G3 speakers would take on some issues and doctrines. But this is how someone like Dr. Josh Buice could be tempted to leverage these differences to stir up strife and possibly boost his own profile. So why did Dr. Voddie Baucham have a friendly conversation with Doug Wilson, and is this promoting Christian nationalism? Boom! That's kind of something that Dr. Buice kind of pointed out through an anonymous account. So why would Dr. Buice criticize some of these people anonymously while gleefully inviting them to be speakers at G3? That's the question that we would like to have a good answer to and understand. And I say, well, who knows? But I do have a theory. It might even be a subconscious problem. Remember, there is an overlap in the fans, if you want to call them that, of each speaker. Dr. Baucham would have particular fans. Some of them could be fans of another speaker, but there are some that follow Dr. Baucham more than they follow others. There are plenty of people who feel blessed by all the speakers, but each one of them is going to have their own set of followers that they'll bring to the table. Dr. John Piper would have his unique subset, and Dr. Voddie Baucham has his, and Virgil Walker has his, and so on. So inviting all of these well-known speakers to G3 was surely a recipe for its growth and success. So more people attend, and more people pay registration fees, and more books get sold. So Dr. Buice isn't going to disinvite any of them for that reason. He would happily minister with them and have dinner with them and laugh with them, but understandably he has some disagreements with several of them nonetheless. And I think we all have disagreements with some of them because they all have different positions in some things. So if Dr. Buice has a gripe, how does he handle it without affecting the success of G3? Well, that's where anonymity comes in. He can vent his frustration anonymously without having to confront these people in person and possibly upset the success of G3. And there are a few examples of that using the X account called A Voice Crying in the Darkness. Dr. Buice criticized Doug Wilson and Tom Ascol by saying, the Wilson-Ascol combo trying to leech off the success of G3, and then later on the post that it would be safe to say that Buice or G3 will not engage in similar ways. On another post he said, it's apparent that Douglas Wills, the Douglas Wilson handle, and Canon Press need G3 Conference to grow their platform. It's also apparent that they copied Josh Buice with the flamethrower, late to the party. Now, besides these sounding kind of childish, do you notice a trend with these posts? He seemed to express his criticism with sort of an envy that these speakers had a platform that the G3 helped. And he didn't have quite the platform that they had. And also notice from these two posts that I quoted from that he would mention his own real name as the standard bearer. It seemed that Dr. Buice was trying to sow discord to lessen the influence of other speakers and possibly redirect that influence to Josh Buice. But this secret scheme wasn't meant to last. And as we see Proverbs 16:18, pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Now I want us all to consider this. What was the biggest issue that made this scandal as big as it became? Was it, in fact, the libel on social media? Well, plenty of people criticize others online. I know I've probably done it. Perhaps you have. And for those of us who aren't well known, any account we may use may as well be an anonymous account. I mean, was that bad what he did there? Sure. Was it something that in and of itself would disqualify him from ministry? Well, I think if Dr. Buice had been more open about it and had resolved it with those he criticized, he could have healed and moved on. But what made this the tragic scandal that it became was not the libel per se. It was the lying. Persistent, bald-faced lying, unfortunately. And that's what is so shocking and disturbing. I mean, it hurts my brain. It just shakes me to my core to know that someone like Dr. Josh Buice could preach a sermon called Essential Principles for Christian Living on February 16th and one called The Danger of Self-Righteousness on April 27th, while having lied through his teeth when asked about his anonymous posts for about 2 years' time. And he flat out denied that he posted them. And then on May 4th, as the Praise Mills Baptist Church statement says, elders confronted him and they pressed him for over 2 hours and presented enough incriminating evidence that he finally had to buckle. Man, that's just a tough pill to swallow. I know others have commented that this whole thing shows cowardice, and yes, unfortunately it does. I know others have pointed out that Buice should have been willing to discuss his grievances with those that he criticized, those ministers that he criticized. He should have been willing to discuss it with them in person because he even knows them personally. And that's true. But how many of us are willing sometimes to be keyboard warriors and vomit out accusations online about people that we would never say those things to their face? So just how unusual is this? Yes, this whole thing seems weird, I know. But you know what? There is an element of sense to it. And why? Pride led him to criticize his fellows anonymously, to tear them down, to build himself up. Pride leads to other sins. And Buice did have a platform. He did have a huge ministry. He had an awful lot to lose. A lot. Do you think a little thing like a lie was going to keep him from trying to save his own skin? If there was any chance of getting through this unscathed, as people would keep asking, is this you? Did you say this? I imagine that this incident, when he finally had to confess, this 2-hour struggle, this probably felt for him like a fight or flight experience. I bet there was a lot of heart pumping going on. But let this be a stern warning for us. Do not let pride begin to sprout. If you see a sprout of pride coming out of the soil, stomp it, crush it, pull it up by the roots, burn it, salt the soil where its seed penetrated the surface. I'm not kidding. I'm not exaggerating. Pride is a cancer. It enters through the front door. It comes when you don't expect it. It comes when you think you're immune to it. It's a horrible sin that leaves destruction in its wake. Pride leads to sexual sins, and pride leads to financial fraud, and pride leads to making anonymous posts online and lying about it. Pride leaves good ministries in ruins. Pride divides Christians where division is not even warranted. Pride is the original sin of the devil. Pride can make you criticize Dr. Josh Buice and not even be aware of your own vulnerability. Have I made myself clear? I cannot beg you strongly enough. Treat pride as your enemy and seek the armor of humility. Fight pride like your life depends upon it. And to close out this episode, I ask you please to pray for Dr. Josh Buice, that he is indeed experiencing repentance and healing. And I thank God that he can draw a straight line with a crooked stick. I thank God for how he has used Dr. Buice in the past to help people despite this tragedy. I pray that God will give any of his converts and disciples the discernment so that this issue won't affect their faith. But most of all, I pray for myself that God will shield me from the allures of pride. I pray that God will use the awareness of this so that we don't look at Dr. Buice as someone to ridicule, but as an example to examine ourselves and to protect our own selves. I pray for anyone listening to this episode to take this issue to heart as a warning for their own ministry. I also pray the ministers who were hurt by Dr. Buice's words will have the humility and the willingness to offer forgiveness and reconciliation, and that they and all of us will have the heart of the Apostle Paul when he wrote these words from Philippians chapter 1, verses 15 through 18. Some indeed preach Christ even of envy and strife, and some also of good will. The one preach Christ of contention, not sincerely, supposing to add affliction to my bonds, but the other of love, knowing that I am set for the defense of the gospel. What then? Notwithstanding, every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached, and I therein do rejoice, yea, and will rejoice. So I pray that we have that same humility that the Apostle Paul has. I pray that we have the same humility that he had to recognize just how much pride can destroy ministers and bring people down to lead to them doing things that they would never see themselves do years down the line. Pray that we will come away from this not as critics, but as self-reflective, and that we will treat pride as the enemy that it truly is, that we will seek humility all things, that we will realize what the purpose of Christian ministry is. It's not about ourselves, it is to uplift Christ. That no matter how small or how large we become in our influence, that we will be the same person, always humble before our God, always realizing that it is Christ whom we exalt and not ourselves, and that we will avoid the temptation to cut others down to lift ourselves up. I pray that we will rethink the problems that celebrity ministry causes and treat ministry the way it ought to be treated, exalting Christ and helping others. Well, I hope that this episode was encouraging and challenging, not just for you, but for myself as well. And I pray that you will consider staying tuned for the next episode of Truth Espresso, and God bless.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Truth Espresso. Be sure to subscribe and rate it on your favorite podcast app. Truthspresso is a member of the Christian podcast community. Check out other great faith-building shows at ChristianPodcastCommunity.org.